Ferdinand VII, the most perverted king in history, and the tragedy that brought down an entire dynasty. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1834, at the Royal Palace in Madrid, the most powerful king of Spain drew his final breath. But for the royal family and his courtiers, the nightmare was far from over. His death did not close a dark chapter. It merely opened the door to the deepest, darkest secrets of the Bourbon court. Inside King Ferdinand II's private chamber, a horrifying secret was about to be revealed. A secret that haunted him all his life, brought misery to three queens, paralyzed the royal court, and pushed an entire empire to the brink of collapse. Strange rituals, deviant desires, and calculated relationships became an indelible stain on the history of Spain. This is not merely the story of a depraved king, but also a warning about the destructive power of absolute rule, when the throne becomes nothing more than a tool to satisfy personal lust. Behind it lies the tragedy of centuries-long royal inbreeding, a hereditary wound passed down from generation to generation, weakening a once mighty dynasty. And now, as we look back, the question remains, would Spain's fate have been different if there had never been a Ferdinand II? Part 1. The Curse of Royal Blood. Ferdinand VII was born in 1784, the eldest son of King Charles IV and Queen Maria Louisa. On paper, this was a perfect royal marriage, linking the most powerful bloodlines in Europe. In reality, however, Charles and Maria Louisa were first cousins, a type of union that had long become a tradition among the Spanish nobility. For centuries, the Habsburg and Bourbon dynasties had insisted on maintaining consanguineous marriages to ensure that their territories, power, and wealth would not fall into foreign hands. These unions did not just occur for a few generations, they continued for hundreds of years, steadily weakening the gene pool. As a result, many members of the royal family were born with physical deformities, underdeveloped intellect, mental illnesses, or chronic health disorders. Historians call this the hereditary curse, a ticking time bomb hidden in the blood waiting to explode in some future generation. Ferdinand was one of its most notable victims. At birth, he did not have the obvious facial deformities, such as protruding jaws or hooked noses, features often seen in inbred monarchs, but his health was frail. He was prone to illness, slow to recover, and often had to avoid physical activity. More seriously, Ferdinand's most severe deformity lay in a place no one dared to mention publicly: his genitals. This was a congenital defect that made his married life abnormal and severely affected his ability to produce heirs. In a feudal court, where producing a male successor was considered a king's sacred duty, this defect was nothing less than a death sentence for Ferdinand's reputation and authority. Due to its sensitive nature, this secret was kept under the strictest secrecy in the Madrid court. Only a small circle of royal physicians and a few trusted courtiers knew the truth. Yet, no matter how carefully it was hidden, the consequences gradually revealed themselves. Queens entered marriage with Ferdinand, only to face wedding nights filled with disappointment, humiliating medical examinations, and whispers that spread throughout the palace. This hereditary affliction not only deprived Ferdinand of his ability to fulfill the sacred role of a monarch, but also sowed suspicion, intrigue, and division throughout the court. From this point on, the fate of Ferdinand and the entire Bourbon dynasty began its tragic descent. Part 2. A weapon, both a source of pride and a mark of shame. From his teenage years, as his body began to change, Ferdinand left the royal physicians at the Madrid palace both astonished and perplexed. During a routine medical examination for the prince, they discovered that his manhood was of an extraordinary and almost unbelievable size. Not only was it far longer than normal, but its shape was so unusual that it defied any polite description. One royal physician, in a secret record preserved many years later, left a vivid account. Slim at the base like the handle of a cane, but swelling at the tip like a clenched fist, and so long it could be used as a walking stick. This was not mere satirical exaggeration, but an accurate description from someone who had examined him in person. Ironically, in the context of Spanish aristocratic society at the time, ideals of male beauty in noble circles were the exact opposite of what Ferdinand possessed. The royal standard was a slender physique, and in this private regard, the royal member was expected to be small, refined, and elegant, symbolizing delicacy, nobility, and self-control. Ferdinand's bizarre shape, however, was considered coarse, even animalistic, completely at odds with the ideal image of a graceful monarch. From banquets and wine table conversations to the dark corridors of the palace, the story of the prince's unusual weapon began to circulate in discreet whispers. No one dared speak of it to his face, but the mocking glances, the half smiles, and the murmurs behind his back were enough for Ferdinand to sense that he was different. This difference brought him no pride. On the contrary, it became a source of lingering shame. From a young age, Ferdinand lived with a sense of inferiority, convinced that he was the target of hidden jokes. That insecurity gradually turned into hatred toward those who mocked him, and toward the social standards that had made him an outcast. Along with it grew an increasing paranoia. Ferdinand came to believe that everyone was talking about him behind his back, and that the smiles and respectful nods of his courtiers were laced with ridicule. This hidden shame became a defining element of his authoritarian, cruel, and psychologically unstable nature when he ascended the throne. For Ferdinand, this weapon was both a mental burden and a silent driving force behind many of the strange and sometimes brutal decisions he made throughout his reign. Part 3. A childhood of humiliation and the making of a ruthless nature. Ferdinand VII grew up within the cold marble walls of the Madrid royal palace, where power and intrigue intertwined like an invisible web. From an early age, he witnessed scenes that a prince should never have seen. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, openly engaging in an affair with Manuel de Godoy, the most powerful courtier in the kingdom, right in front of the courtiers and even the king himself. Charles IV, Ferdinand's father, was so weak-willed that he accepted this humiliation merely to preserve his throne and avoid confronting Godoy's influence. In such an environment, Ferdinand quickly learned a bitter truth. Power was not meant to protect justice or the people. It was to exact revenge, conceal weaknesses, and impose fear upon others. He understood that any sign of vulnerability would be exploited and used as a weapon for humiliation. And with his physical defect and the persistent rumors circulating in the court, that fear haunted him every day. There were times when, if a servant or guard happened to see him naked by accident, Ferdinand would immediately erupt in rage. Such individuals were often severely punished and in many cases banished from Madrid for life as a way to erase witnesses to his personal shame. In Ferdinand's mind, no one was allowed to know, and certainly no one had the right to speak about his body. These bitter childhood experiences gradually forged a calculating and ruthless personality. Ferdinand learned to conceal his true emotions, showing only a cold exterior and an air of absolute authority. He trusted few people, frequently testing the loyalty of his courtiers with unreasonable commands, just to see who would dare to oppose him. Whenever he felt threatened or suspected mockery, he was ready to eliminate his target without hesitation. It was this combination of personal insecurity, a childhood filled with humiliation, and a treacherous political environment that created an authoritarian, suspicious, and emotionally detached Ferdinand VII. These psychological wounds would follow him until the end of his life, shaping his rule and fueling the tragedies that the Bourbon dynasty would be forced to endure. Part 4. A nightmare marriage with Maria Antonia. In 1802, at the age of 24, Ferdinand VII officially married Princess Maria Antonia of the Two Sicilies, his first cousin from the Bourbon branch in Naples. Maria Antonia was just 17 at the time and was praised as one of the most beautiful princesses in Europe. Porcelain white skin, silky black hair, sparkling sea blue eyes, and a gentle, graceful demeanor. She had grown up in a palace filled with music, festivities, and fairy tale stories of royal marriages. In the mind of the young maiden, her wedding night would be the sweet moment that opened a new chapter of her life. But when the bedroom door closed, that dream shattered instantly. The moment Ferdinand removed his ornate garments, Maria Antonia was nearly struck speechless. What she saw was unlike anything she had ever imagined. Her husband's manhood was not only excessively long, but also oddly swollen at the tip, an unsettling sight that evoked both fear and confusion. According to a later account by a royal physician, Maria Antonia trembled, burst into tears, and could not bring herself to approach her husband. The situation grew so tense that the royal physicians, who had long been aware of this secret, were forced to intervene. They stood just outside the bedchamber, instructing Ferdinand step by step on how to fulfill his duty, while also preparing a special set of instruments, a kind of sheath and lubricant designed to make intercourse possible without causing serious harm to the queen. The entire process resembled a surgical procedure more than an intimate moment, with whispered instructions, mechanical movements, and an atmosphere that was tense and cold. From that night on, their marital relations were always an ordeal. Each time they were intimate, Maria Antonia experienced pain and fear, leaving her unable to feel any semblance of happiness. The forced, unnatural relations led her to suffer multiple miscarriages, at least 3, according to records, and her health steadily declined. The once rosy-cheeked, radiant princess grew pale, her eyes sunken, her body so thin it seemed to be only skin and bone. For Ferdinand, every failed attempt to carry a pregnancy to term was another blow to his already fragile pride. He became increasingly suspicious, quick to anger, and eventually convinced himself that his wife deliberately avoided bearing children to sabotage his future. This mistrust soon turned into arguments, cold silences, and ultimately a marriage devoid of love, sustained only by political obligation and pressure from the royal family. In the dark corridors of the Madrid palace, rumors spread swiftly. Ferdinand was incapable of fathering children, and all the tragedies of Queen Maria Antonia were merely the inevitable consequence of a hereditary curse. These whispers, though never spoken directly to their faces, were like invisible daggers piercing them both, turning this royal marriage into a painful tragedy from the wedding night until its bitter end. Part 5. The poisoning allegations and the obsession with having a son. The final years of Princess Maria Antonia's life were marked by illness, exhaustion, and despair. After multiple miscarriages, her body was nearly depleted of strength. Medical care at the time was primitive, but for a queen, treatment was still exceptionally attentive, which made her death in 1806 all the more unusual and suspicious. Maria Antonia died suddenly after a violent fever, even though just a few days earlier she had been well enough to attend a banquet at the palace. Immediately, rumors began to spread. She had been poisoned. Whispers pointed in several directions. Some suspected factions opposed to the Bourbon dynasty of Naples, others blamed the camp of Manuel de Godoy, the powerful figure Ferdinand despised, and still others quietly suggested that Ferdinand himself was involved, or at least knew about it, and chose to remain silent. Notably, the queen's personal apothecary, the man responsible for preparing her tonics and medicinal herbs, also died only a few days later. This death further fueled suspicion, especially when it was revealed that he had left behind a hastily written letter. However, the letter was immediately seized by royal guards and vanished without a trace. Its contents were never made public, but historians believe it may have contained evidence or a confession related to the incident. For Ferdinand, Maria Antonia's death was not seen as the tragic end of a marriage, but as a release from a life of tension and disappointment. In his mind, the problem did not lie in himself or his physical deformities, but in his wife's supposed lack of cooperation and failure to fulfill her duty of producing a male heir. Her death only reinforced this warped belief, prompting Ferdinand to quickly turn his attention to finding a new wife. However, by this time, his notorious reputation had spread across Europe. Royal courts, which placed immense value on preserving bloodlines and ensuring the physical fitness of heirs, had heard the rumors of his grotesque deformity and the haunting wedding nights. Many princesses, despite political advantages, were refused by their families when a marriage to Ferdinand was proposed. This only deepened his obsession with securing a wife who could bear him a son, no matter the cost. From this point onward, Ferdinand's life entered a new chapter. His subsequent marriages would not only continue his personal tragedies, but would also give rise to ruthless political decisions, all driven by a single consuming obsession: to have a son who would secure the Bourbon throne. Part 6. The Next Marriages in Hell. After the mysterious death of Maria Antonia, Ferdinand VII wasted little time in seeking a new bride. His goal remained unchanged: to have a wife who would bear him a male heir. Yet from the very outset, these subsequent marriages carried the seeds of tragedy, for Ferdinand never saw his wives as life partners, but merely as instruments to fulfill his reproductive ambitions. His second wife, Maria Isabel of Portugal, a gentle princess who once dreamed of a peaceful life beside the king, quickly realized she had stepped into a gilded prison. Her wedding night, much like Maria Antonia's before her, was anything but romantic. Court physicians and special instruments still had to be present to assist, turning marital intimacy into a cold medical procedure. There were no tender embraces, no whispered words of affection, only dry, clinical instructions given from behind a door, under the watchful eyes of those ordered to ensure the mission succeeded. When Maria Isabel died young from complications after childbirth, delivering a daughter, not the male heir Ferdinand longed for, he immediately remarried, this time to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. Maria Josepha, a devout and naive young woman, untouched in both body and spirit, was deeply shocked upon entering Ferdinand's world. Not only did she endure intimacies that felt more like surgical operations, but she also lived under near absolute surveillance. Ferdinand, plagued by insecurity and paranoia, placed his queens under a strict 24/7 monitoring regime. They could not write letters without his or his agent's prior reading and approval. Every meal was meticulously inspected, not only for fear of poisoning, but also to ensure they took no herbs or medicines that could prevent pregnancy. Their movements within the palace were heavily restricted. Whenever the queen stepped out of her chamber, attendants and guards always accompanied her. The fear of betrayal haunted Ferdinand. He believed that any wife might secretly consort with another man, and if that happened, the child born would not carry pure Bourbon blood. This paranoia led him to suspect every glance, every greeting, even the familial relationships of his wives. Sudden interrogations, unreasonable prohibitions, and veiled threats turned married life into a living hell. Under Ferdinand's controlling hand and erratic temperament, marriage was no longer a space for sharing and love. It became a prison cell, where women bearing the title of queen lived each day in fear, humiliation, and loneliness. And no matter how many wives he replaced, Ferdinand could not escape the tragic cycle. Wedding nights like surgical operations, young deaths, and an unrelenting obsession with a male heir that would never be satisfied. Part 7. When humiliation became a national issue. By the time he reached middle age, Ferdinand VII had to face a bitter reality. Despite multiple marriages, he still had no legitimate male heir to inherit the throne. In an absolute monarchy, where the crown was passed down through the male line, this was not merely the king's personal concern, it was a crisis of national importance. The opposition faction within the court, long discontent with Ferdinand's autocratic rule and erratic temperament, quickly seized this opportunity. They spread malicious rumors claiming that heaven had cursed the House of Bourbon and that the inbred royal bloodline was in terminal decline. Stories about Ferdinand's defects and unusual marital life, once confined to palace corridors, were now amplified and leaked, becoming a political weapon to undermine the prestige of the monarchy. But the most serious impact unfolded across the ocean. In the 19th century, a wave of independence movements was surging through Spain's South American colonies, from Argentina, Chile, and Venezuela to Colombia. Revolutionary leaders like Simón Bolívar quickly recognized the symbolic value of a powerless, sexually weak king. It was the perfect image to stir public contempt and outrage toward the colonial regime. Secret pamphlets began circulating in colonial cities, featuring grotesque caricatures of Ferdinand, sometimes as a frail man leaning on a cane or sitting helplessly on a broken throne. Some illustrations were more suggestive, depicting the king alongside mocking symbols of manhood, which everyone in the colonies understood without needing an explanation. In Europe, rumors of Ferdinand's impotence were enough to cause embarrassment. In South America, they became a revolutionary tool. The image of a king unable to produce a legitimate heir served as a metaphor for a decaying regime, incapable of ruling or guiding its people. This gossip, combined with Ferdinand's failure to regain control of the colonies through military means, drastically eroded his authority. From then on, Ferdinand's personal tragedy was no longer a private matter confined to the bedroom or palace halls. It became a national issue. His humiliation was exposed and exploited until it transformed into a political symbol, helping fuel the undercurrents that would topple an empire once spanning both sides of the Atlantic. Part 8. The Collapse of the Court and the King. The final years of Ferdinand VII's life were a stretch of despair and unease, as both his personal fate and the Spanish Empire slid into unstoppable decline. Each time a queen announced a pregnancy, the palace was instantly filled with hope. Yet the joy was always short-lived. Just months later, the grim news of a miscarriage would spread, along with whispers about the imperfection of the royal bloodline. For Ferdinand, each loss was not only the death of a child, but also the loss of his sole chance to keep the throne from falling into the hands of the opposition. Every emotional blow pushed him deeper into severe depression, locking himself in his chambers, refusing to meet with courtiers, and letting state affairs stall for weeks at a time. During these periods, the court was virtually paralyzed, as no one dared make decisions for fear of crossing the king's will. His obsession with bloodline purity and his fear that any child might not be his became a form of political paranoia. Ferdinand ordered investigations, interrogations, and even surveillance of every man who had the slightest opportunity to be near the queens. From guards and advisors to household servants, no one was beyond suspicion. Some were imprisoned merely for smiling too long at the queen during a banquet. The atmosphere in the palace grew increasingly suffocating, filled with fear on the surface and simmering resentment underneath. While the king imprisoned himself in suspicion and personal humiliation, the Spanish Empire outside was fracturing. The colonies in Latin America, already in rebellion, were now almost completely independent. Each report of another lost territory was like another knife to Ferdinand's already weakened prestige. Spain, once an empire spanning both sides of the Atlantic, had shrunk into a reduced kingdom, stripped of colonial revenue and mired in economic crisis. Opponents within the country whispered that the nation's fate mirrored that of its king, a body once strong, now impotent, defective, unable to produce, and unable to sustain life. Ferdinand VII, once an ambitious prince, was now only a faded shadow, haunted by the past and abandoned by the future. Part 9. Death and the Anatomical Secret. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII drew his final breath at the royal palace in Madrid, ending a reign marked by controversy, scandal, and personal tragedy. News of his death quickly spread across Europe, but it was not until weeks later that chilling accounts from the dissection room began to leak. In accordance with royal custom, Ferdinand's body was preserved and examined in preparation for a grand burial. The royal physicians conducting the autopsy struggled to mask their horror when they uncovered the secret the king had hidden all his life. Not only was he born with congenital deformities in the form and structure of his genitals, but his body also bore deep, regular scars, evidence that he had undergone multiple surgeries, or perhaps even crude self-inflicted interventions. The structure of Ferdinand's organ was severely malformed, the base unusually small, the shaft bent asymmetrically, the head unnaturally swollen with thick, prominent veins. Across it were coarse suture marks, not the work of skilled surgeons, but rather the telltale signs of experimental operations, possibly carried out by the king himself or by reckless physicians at his command. Some scars had healed decades earlier, while others were still fresh and red, proving that these interventions spanned many years, continuing even into the final months of his life. These acts of self-reconstruction stemmed from an intense desire to be seen as a normal man in the eyes of his wives, the court, and history. Ferdinand believed that if he could repair his body, he would preserve his marriages, father a legitimate male heir, and silence the rumors about the Bourbon dynasty's impotence. But every attempt failed. Each surgery brought only physical agony and emotional torment, leaving behind yet another scar, a permanent testament to his hopeless desperation. When the examination ended, the physicians quietly closed the files, sealed all records, and ordered absolute secrecy. Yet within the palace walls, rumors still swirled. People whispered that even in death, Ferdinand could not escape the shadow of the royal curse, a curse that had destroyed his life and helped push Spain into an era of decline. Part 10. The Legacy of a Royal Tragedy. The death of Ferdinand VII did not merely end the life of a king. It left behind a dark legacy that would haunt Spain for decades. He was both the product of generations of inbreeding within the Bourbon dynasty and a perpetrator who perpetuated and deepened those very mistakes. His three official wives, Maria Antonia, Maria Isabel, and Maria Josefa, each died in loneliness, illness, and emotional anguish. None of these marriages produced a legitimate male heir, and even his daughter, Princess Isabella, was the subject of whispered doubts about her parentage from certain factions. These malicious rumors further wounded the royal family's honor, plunging the court into a vicious struggle for power immediately after his death. During his reign, Ferdinand became notorious for his authoritarianism and extreme conservatism. He brutally crushed all liberal movements, restored absolute monarchy, and imprisoned or executed those who dared to oppose him. His repressive policies not only deepened public resentment, but also fueled independence movements across Spain's colonies in Latin America. Within just a few decades, the once vast Spanish Empire, spanning continents, shrank to a pitiful remnant of its former glory. Beyond his political failures, Ferdinand's personal legacy was a profoundly human tragedy. He lived his life burdened by shame, obsession, and fear, haunted by his physical deformities, trapped in loveless marriages, and consumed by the dread of losing power. These forces combined to shape him into a suspicious, isolated, and ruthless ruler, willing to sacrifice both personal happiness and the nation's future in defense of so-called royal dignity. History remembers Ferdinand VII not only as an incompetent and reactionary monarch, but also as a living testament to the consequences of inbreeding, political blindness, and the prioritization of power over the welfare of the nation. His legacy was an empire in decline, a fractured society, and a stain on history that Spain would take generations to mend. The story of Ferdinand VII stands as a reminder that the mistakes of the past, whether born of tradition, ambition, or stubbornness, can haunt and destroy the future of an entire country. And sometimes, the tragedy of a single individual is enough to alter the destiny of millions.